Welcome to the Autonomic Healing Podcast. I'm Tom Pells.
And I'm Ruth Lawrenson. We'll be unpacking what it looks like to activate your brain to holistically manage stress and trauma that bring healing to the mind, body, and spirit.
Being free to live authentically as humans.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started. Tom, we're here talking about rational intimacy. It's our little mini series that we've been wanting to do. And our last session, we gave an overview of those 8 stages of rational intimacy and those core strengths associated with them. Now, rational intimacy is this whole other paradigm, and it's an alternative way to live instead of swimming in that tsunami of stress, right?
Or, as I like to say, instead of swimming in the tsunami, trying to breathe underwater as we're drowning in it.
Yes. I would love us in this episode, we did the kind of intellectual overview, so to speak, last time, but can we just go a bit deeper on this topic of rational intimacy and maybe start with what inspired you to develop rational intimacy's paradigm? I mean, what led to this way? Yeah.
The tsunami of stress is not simply a description of an escalating pattern of flight or fight responses to sensed or perceived threat. It is a lived experience of dysfunctional, intimate relationship with ourselves and others. And as a minister for a decade and a half, and then as a therapist for about the same amount of time, I was engaging with people who, to one degree or another, were experiencing the impact of unrelieved stress and trauma in their lives. And because of my own stress and trauma in childhood and growing up, was living in it myself. That's why I am very observant of those things, because I've lived all that.
Yeah.
The tsunami of stress was a way to make the dynamics of the dysfunction in the relationships understandable and observable and interruptible.
I think what's interesting there is that, just in terms of the tsunami, it's not just, when we think about the impact of stress and trauma, we often associate, one of the reasons why I came to you was just physical symptoms and all of that stuff. But actually, there's something so important here to get hold of, that one of the biggest impacts of the tsunami of stress is the way it affects our intimacy with other people.
Oh, yeah.
And the way we relate to others, ourselves, others. And so I think
makes it either unhealthy or even abusive, or doesn't happen.
Yeah. And so, it's not just a case of living our lives without stress, because that won't happen, but it's a way in which, how do we live our lives in a way we can have these healthy relationships? And so what we're talking about in this episode, guys, is not just the theory of rational intimacy, but what allows us to experience rational intimacy, rather being stuck in those cycles of fight and flight, in that tsunami of stress, where our relationships with ourselves and others are really impacted detrimentally. And so can you start us off there? Like, how do we experience this, Tom?
Yeah. The reason peace and well-being can seem so elusive and fleeting is because of a lack of homeostasis. Whether that's in body or body and mind, or body, mind, and spirit, it's that lack of homeostasis, which is why peace and well-being are so elusive.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was growing up in northern Michigan, the summer nights would sometimes be filled with fireflies. The darkness, punctuated by those captivating flickers of light, moving and dancing, here in front of me, no, there next to me, no, over there across the yard. I remember trying to catch them in my mom's glass canning jars. The little lights in the dark night were so beautiful, just captivating. When I was able to catch one, I could stare at the jar in my hand as that little bug would turn its light on and off. And after a few minutes, I would unscrew the lid and then let it fly free again. Peace and well-being seemed to me as elusive and fleeting as those lightning bugs. And you may be wondering why I'm talking about fireflies or lightning bugs, depending upon where you live, in a podcast episode about rational intimacy.
I wasn't going to say anything, but now you mention it.
Yeah, because it's all about the dynamics of what is happening, not just what we are observing. The tsunami of stress and rational intimacy, its alternative, are about seeing the realities of what is happening, not simply observing it. The escalating pattern of flight or fight, attempting to avoid a sensed or perceived threat to well-being, whether it is actually even in reality that, and then trying to control it, if we can't, has an increasingly detrimental impact on the people involved and their experience of intimacy. And that's where the fireflies come in, because this is where most people live. They may look otherwise, but that isn't the truth. That isn't what they've been living, which is why, for many, they listen to this podcast. Because it's like, oh, this is helping me understand some things that I was experiencing and couldn't make any sense of.
So that fleeting feeling, so many people experience that. And so feel like they wish it could be better than that. There's just those tiny little flickers of peace that can come in through a day, but why can't it be more?
Yes, fireflies.
Mm-hmm.
As a child, I would observe the fireflies as their lights would turn on and off in what seemed to me a random way. Now here, now there, now over and over, and now long periods of nothing. Where did they go? And I remember, as a kid, I liked to read the encyclopedias.
I remember that.
So I remember getting out the encyclopedia and learning about fireflies. There's all sorts of information up here in my brain.
And I've got a feeling you're going to tell us all about it.
I am going to tell you all about it. It turns out those pretty lights are actually pretty impactful to firefly intimacy. And in the same ways that the tsunami of stress and rational intimacy are impactful to us. A firefly is actually a kind of beetle. It's not a fly at all. It's just a beetle that flies. And the lights have a purpose, many purposes, other than to simply entertain us as human beings. The flashes of lights have several purposes. One is the recurring pattern is about dating and mating. Talk about rational intimacy. Male fireflies fly around hoping to attract the interests of a partner with a flashing pattern that is specifically to their own species, and there are thousands of species of fireflies. Some fireflies flash once, others flash up to 9 times. And the females watch for a particularly impressive display and show they're interested by responding with a single flash, which is timed to follow the male's flashes. Turns out, fireflies are not so different from us as humans. They want what we want. Intimacy. They're just more rational about it than we are. Rational intimacy is about connecting with others for individual and communal well-being. But the flashing lights are interestingly also about the tsunami of stress in a beetle kind of way. Firefly blood contains a defensive steroid that makes them unappetizing to predators who get a really unpleasant taste, which they associate with the firefly light and avoid them in the future. So the flashing lights are a part of their protective system against the threat of being eaten. The tsunami of stress.
Talk about a tsunami of stress.
Yeah, get eaten. There you go. And speaking of being eaten, female fireflies will actually imitate the flash of a rival type of female firefly so they can lure the males in and eat them. And taking into their own little beetle bodies the steroids of the other beetle, they become distasteful to predators. Bonus!
It's genius.
Yes, it is. And it would be all well and good in the firefly world if it weren't for us humans.
Mm.
and our tsunamis. If you're older like I am, then you've probably noticed there aren't as many fireflies around as there were a few decades ago, which is very sad. To fireflies, their flashing lights are about survival and thrival, if I may. As human beings, we like to light up the night to keep ourselves safe from the threats in the darkness. But that light pollution means that the tiny little lights the fireflies emit can't compete. And rather than moving off someplace where we haven't polluted the night, the fireflies just disappear and their little lights just go out. Rather than fleeing and fighting sensed or perceived threats that may or may not actually even exist, and in the process become a threat to ourselves and others, in the tsunami of stress, there's an alternative. It's rational intimacy. The tsunami of stress can eventually build to the point that we harm ourselves and others and then leave that harm unresolved in a way that is detrimental to ourselves and others. And the pattern just keeps going. But rational intimacy is about a deepening connection that is beneficial to others and ourselves. Rational intimacy is about being rational in our intimate relationships. So if we're going to understand rational intimacy, it's kind of important to understand rationality.
Yes, that's so true. And understanding rationality, I mean, it seems so simple, doesn't it? You would think rationally, you would think we'd understand rationality.
Sure.
But actually, if we look around us, human behaviour, and even in our own lives or in our history, rationality can be so elusive, can't it, Tom? So I'm interested in how do we even understand what's rational? I mean, I know that sounds like a bizarre question to ask.
No, that's a very important one, and we could fill hours and hours of conversation trying to define it to start with and debate it. And there's all sorts of monographs that have been published and whole treatment methodologies about rationality and all that. Turns out it's really very basic. We all have perceptions of self, others, and situations. Those perceptions have been rewarded and reinforced. They've perhaps even because of stress and trauma been imposed on us. And we have these perceptions of self, others, and situations that because of the stress and trauma are probably not actually rational. But they seem rational to us.
Yes.
So, like I said before, when those perceptions have been distorted by the impact of unresolved stress and trauma, the first letter of self, others, and situations, SOS, is the internationally recognized distress signal. Save our souls.
And that's what we're in, distress.
Yes, and that's what the tsunami of stress is. It's an SOS.
Yeah.
We just don't hear it that way. And we may not experience it that way, but it is. And it is all the result of a fundamental confusion of what we are perceiving that is, curiously, at the heart of the creation story in the first of the books that form the book for three of the world's major religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And that's the book of Genesis. It is good. Genesis means beginning or creation of something. And in the case of the book of Genesis, it is the beginning or creation of everything. But it's not just the creation of everything. It's why it's the way it is.
Yes.
The nature of the dynamics in it. So as the story goes, the creator repeatedly observed what was created and repeatedly described it as good. It is good. And when everything had been created, the creator then said, "It is very good." Then the creator got the first human all set up in paradise, the Garden of Eden, where everything was very good. And he filled it with everything necessary for that human to survive and thrive. But there was only one human being. And God asked that human being to look around and comment on what he noticed. And the human said, well, there's 2 of everything and 1 of me.
That's not fair, right?
And the Creator said, that is not beneficial. It is not good for a human being to be alone. So, God, the Creator, did something about it. Created another one. A second human being. And he pronounced that arrangement very beneficial.
And so right at the heart of that story, immediately we see how intimacy is such a beneficial, well, it's part of how we're created as human beings to live.
And because of a very loving Creator, where it wasn't beneficial, doesn't mean it was detrimental to be alone. It just wasn't beneficial. Made it so. By creating another one. And the Creator had put 2 trees in the garden that were symbolic of surviving and thriving. One translated the tree of life. The Creator said, go ahead, enjoy eating from that one. And I've wondered if the tree of life is the tree of homeostasis. That's just a curious, weird thing in my head. Because homeostasis is life, and that was the tree of life. But the other was called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. At least that's how it's usually translated into English. Those words mean something much more and different in the original language. Hebrew. Knowledge doesn't just mean having facts, information, and data. And it also means more than awareness and understanding. The original word carries a sense of responsibility for decision making. What to do with those facts and information? What to do with that sense of awareness and understanding? An analogy that I've used is the discovery of how to split an atom.
Yeah.
Is that a source of energy to create and support life? Or a means of destroying it at a global scale? Decisions.
So there's this like wisdom around making decisions.
Yes. And the decision making was about a very particular issue.
Yeah.
Good and evil. That word for good means beneficial. Not just good the way I might describe a Big Mac, who a nutritionist would tell me is probably not good. And there goes McDonald's sponsorship. But I love them. They taste so good. I have one every few months or years.
Just for clarity, we are not sponsored by McDonald's.
No, we are not. No. Anyway. So, that word for good means beneficial, which is the outcome of the decision.
Yes.
Is that advantageous? Is it helpful? Is it fruitful? Does it bring a benefit? Does it produce an outcome that promotes life and well-being? And that word for evil means detrimental. Is the outcome of the decision harmful, destructive, or corrupting? Does it produce an outcome that compromises life and well-being, even to the point of the death of intimacy? Now, notice I'm not talking about intentions. I don't really have much time for intentions. It's all about the impact of the decision.
Yeah, I think that that's so helpful to understand. Like, because I think with, good and evil, they're just like words that can roll off us because we, it's just hard for us to grasp.
Right, wrong, good, bad,
like what does that even really
moral,
mean?
Immoral.
But beneficial and detrimental, what different words that mean the same thing gives us a very different lens for seeing things.
Oh, yeah.
So that's so helpful, Tom.
Yeah, that's quite the tree. And the symbolism it communicates is the difference between the tsunami of stress or rational intimacy.
So let me just say, so basically what's detrimental is the tsunami of stress. And then what is beneficial leads us into the rational intimacy. Is that what you mean?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And confusing them? Well, that's trying to breathe underwater. So the Creator said, don't eat from the tree of deciding yourself if something is beneficial or detrimental just because it seems so to you without taking the truth into account. Don't even touch it, because when you do, the result will be the death of intimacy. Intimacy with yourself, intimacy with others, and that's what they found. Eve. Huh, oh my, what about that? Oh, Adam, hello, let's get to someplace and change our wardrobe. They knew the truth. Play God all by yourself and deal in lies, and you will not survive it. It will be the death of intimacy. Live in a rational community. Leave it alone. As I like to say, put the fruit down and back away slowly and make decisions based on truth. And intimacy lives and thrives.
I really like what you're pulling from that story. You know, it's a story that I've heard, you know, I know very well. And I'm sure a lot of people would have heard the story of creation. But I think, you know, we know that the consequence of them eating the fruit was death. And again, a word that's just like massive. And what does that really mean? But the phrase that you've just mentioned, the death of intimacy, I think that's so true. And when you look at, when, you know, you just have to look around in life and history and just think, wow, you know, when you get into that tsunami of stress, when you are confusing beneficial and detrimental, and then what ends up happening is the death of I mean, I just think that's such a phrase, Tom, that's just, you know, it's a sucker punch phrase, you know, of just like, wow, that is so sad that was the consequence of that.
And we're not the only ones who interpret it as death. Oh, not living. That's what Adam did when he saw Eve eat the fruit. Oh, she didn't drop over dead. I think I'll have me some of that.
Yes.
No.
So it's not just,
their eyes were opened.
Yes.
And then they became responsible for deciding if something was beneficial or detrimental.
Which is why we're in a mess.
Yeah. As the story goes, they didn't leave it alone. They didn't do that. They believed the lie, rejected the truth. They ate from that tree that was so tempting, and every time we experience the tsunami, we're doing the same thing. Confusing what is beneficial with what is detrimental is why there is a tsunami.
Yeah.
We think, like those first humans, that something is beneficial when it's actually detrimental. We sense that something is a threat to our well-being based on some past stress or trauma. In their case, it was being lied to. That the Creator was actually keeping them from being wise. But the truth was that by not trying to be the final word on truth, and what is beneficial or detrimental to self and others, and leaving the tree alone, they would have been wise.
So, you know, they were in the garden and everything there was beneficial. And they saw this boundary that God had put on the tree as a detrimental thing, whereas actually it was beneficial. So they confused those two things. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's the tree. That's the point. That's the point. The story.
Yeah. So how does this relate to rational intimacy, Tom?
To start with, actually recognizing what is beneficial and what is detrimental to well-being is rational. I'm going to say that again.
Yes.
That's my definition of rationality. To start with actually recognizing what is beneficial, regardless of whether it seems so or not, and what is detrimental, regardless of whether it seems so or not, to well-being is rational. That is rationality. It is irrational to think that something that is detrimental is beneficial simply because it feels good to us, or we think so, or somebody told us so, or we've been persuaded so. And we can get others to go along with it. Yeah. Detrimental is detrimental, whether it seems or feels like it. Beneficial is beneficial, whether it seems or feels like it.
I think this is so key. I hope our listeners are really getting this point, because I think in the society that we live in, where feelings, I mean, we're driven,
manipulated
strongly by what something feels like, to the point where we'll make our decisions, all of that type of stuff. But actually, if we want to be able to discern what's beneficial and detrimental, it actually hasn't got to do with whether it feels good or not.
No, look at the impact.
Yes.
And I don't even care about people's intentions. I really don't give a fig about people's intentions. I don't. It's helpful to not have malevolent intentions.
Yes. So
but there's a reason it says that the path to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yes.
Because it's not about intentions. It is about the impact. What is the impact of this decision?
Of that decision.
As best I can anticipate.
And so for me, I know that, I've been kind of pursuing living in this new paradigm, relational intimacy. And I know one of the things that I've had to really kind of challenge myself on is, there's such an assumption there sometimes when something appears hard or hurtful or, I don't know, it doesn't feel great. You can kind of assume that that's detrimental, whereas actually often it's beneficial.
Yeah, that's why I talk about productive pain.
Yes, we talked about that.
Because there isn't no pain.
Yeah, we talked about that, didn't we, in another episode?
It's not an option.
About how, and with pain, often we do kind of, because we see it as a detrimental thing, as an assumption, we often just back off, or we want to get through it as quickly as possible. Yeah. But actually, when we see, if we can just pause and think, actually, this feels painful and it feels hard, but what's the impact here? Yeah. And is this beneficial? And let's embrace the pain and make it positive.
Yes. Mm-hmm. When I encounter pain, when human beings encounter pain, we often have a knee-jerk reaction.
Yes.
And I'm not talking about the knee. We become jerks when we have a knee-jerk reaction.
That was quite funny.
Yes, thank you. And for my kids, that's just more of my dad humor. Anyway, the fundamental problem and reason for the tsunami of stress, for the ultimately destructive experiences we as humans have of intimacy and then inflict on ourselves and others, whether that is as individuals or groups of people or as peoples and nations, as we're seeing in Ukraine, is thinking that something is beneficial when it is detrimental.
Yes.
Or vice versa, thinking something is detrimental when it's actually beneficial. Mm-hmm. The first stage in the tsunami of stress is stress and need. And that causes us to flee from the sensed or perceived threat. Intimacy can be and often is sensed as a threat when it has been associated with trauma, abuse, neglect, abandonment. Mm-hmm. When we give in to the temptation to see something that is beneficial and can be beneficial as detrimental, or see something that is detrimental as beneficial, the inevitable next step is distress and discontent, that second stage in the tsunami of stress. And it doesn't go anywhere better from there. It just gets worse.
Yeah, I think, I think I think what you've just mentioned, the fact that, for a lot of people who have experienced trauma, one of the fears that people have is that it will impact, and it does impact, intimacy with others. And I think the fact that we're caught up in this spin over intimacy, we know we want, it's in us. It's in us to relate, to be intimate with one another. And yet, if you've had trauma, like you've mentioned, there's abuse or neglect or all sorts of different types of trauma, it's something that you actually can fear as well.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that is really interesting. And what I think is interesting here is that in some ways, well, it's not in some ways, it is the way. Rational intimacy is a way for people who've really struggled with intimacy because of stuff like trauma, a way in which they can enter into this place where they can assess what's beneficial, what's detrimental, and live in this beneficial space where they can be intimate with others. I mean, it's really quite amazing for people who've, I know that for me, I've struggled with viewing intimacy through a lens
Haven't we all?
Of different situations, different impacts of life experiences. But this gives us a whole new way to live.
It does. That's why the first stage in the pattern of rational intimacy is contentment. Experiencing stress and need, because there is no option where there is no stress and need, but experiencing stress and need, but not viewing it as a threat to well-being.
Yes.
It may seem detrimental. It may seem beneficial. But the truth is that it is and can be, and often is, truly beneficial, no matter what I or another person may have intended it to be. Change just is, and change is stressful. And there's no way to not experience change and stress other than not being alive. There is always change because life is change. That change can be viewed as a threat or an opportunity. We get to choose. I believe that, and remember, I've worked in forensic psychotherapy and treated the impact of stress and trauma for decades. No matter what we have experienced, it can be beneficial. That allows me to experience a sense of contentment or reclaim it when I've lost it. And I do lose it at times.
So how do you claim it back? That is when you basically realise, oh, I'm in the tsunami again. And then, like, you were content and, like, suddenly you're swimming or trying to breathe underwater, I can say. So what do you do in those times when you notice that?
I activate homeostasis. I allow my body to get back there. If it's a cognitive thing, I do the problem solving, let my mind be informed by my brain of what an actual solution would be and help me with that decision making. And if it's at a level of my being, then I do the spiritual formation so that I don't stay in that tsunami and I get to transition into rational intimacy. Yeah. Yes. And that contentment, that first stage in rational intimacy, then naturally or organically leads to the second. Grace. Poise. And gifting. If you've found these podcast episodes beneficial, and many of you are giving us feedback that you are, it is because of rational intimacy in my own life and in your life, Ruth. As someone recently shared with me, I found out about AHA over the weekend and have binge listened to all of your podcasts. They're fantastic. So thank you, dear listeners, for listening. And I only wish I could meet and get to know each and every one of you. I know that's not realistic or going to happen, but it's what I would love to do. And that poise and gifting in rational intimacy is why there's a podcast to listen to instead of me being stuck in the tsunami and trying to breathe underwater.
That's so true. And I think I love that grace and poise. We were chatting just before this episode about how, grace and poise is not, it's actually, it becomes more grace and more poise because of the stress.
Yes.
When you can carry grace and poise in the middle of whatever is going on, that's what makes it grace. And actually what makes it beautiful, I think. There's something beautiful about human beings in that space of grace and poise. So,
and it doesn't mean all is well with the world and we're happy, and that isn't poise. poise is, I'm not losing it. I can manage.
Yes.
I am managing, and my natural gifting can come out, and I can share that.
And it's not pretending.
And be a part of the share. No.
It's not pretending that we've got it all okay. And
no.
It's actually, it's being incredibly real in the moment.
Yes. Which is why the next stage in rational intimacy is engagement and connection. Involved in the situation and risking that.
Yeah.
And then devotion develops, that fundamental commitment to a cause or a person, and it's our own well-being and the well-being of other people. And then that gets to envisioning, and we get to see a vision of what could happen, not fantasize about how I can feel better. And then we step into that vision, we live out that vision. And podcasts happen and all sorts of other stuff. And then we experience that sense of commendation. We get to internalize that sense of, well done. Well done.
Yeah.
And which is incredibly motivating. And then we get to do the whole rational intimacy again. And it just naturally and organically begins to happen and keeps recurring because of homeostasis, because we're fireflies. And we get to let our light shine. And even if that is something where others are lighting their own lights and trying to dispel the darkness, we get to just keep shining.
Oh, that's such a beautiful vision, to be people, as we live out rational intimacy, to be people who shine our lights in the dark, in those dark places.
Fireflies are cool.
Fireflies are cool. Tom, thanks so much. And guys, I hope you have just really enjoyed this episode. It's not like the last one. If you've kind of tuned in for this episode, we just really encourage you to go back one, listen to the first one on rational intimacy, because that really does give you the paradigms overview.
And if you haven't listened to the Tsunami of Stress, listen to that one, because you've probably been living it.
Yes.
And you don't have to.
But I think what was key here really is this idea that, to access rational intimacy, to allow us to experience it, it's really about how we look at what is beneficial, what is detrimental, not based on our feelings, but based on the impact. And the more and more we go down that, I think you're right, there's an organic learning of understanding what those things are. And then we get to have intimacy in a healthy way with others, with ourselves, with others. Yep. And that's such a gift. It's who we're meant to be, is what I believe we're designed how we're designed to live. So anyway, all that to say, we will be continuing this conversation on rational intimacy and the benefits of autonomic healing as we go for our next episode. We can't wait to do that. Thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you at the next episode.
You've been listening to the Autonomic Healing Podcast.
Join us next time as we continue in our conversations with Tom. If you're interested in pursuing your own autonomic healing journey and want to find a practitioner, visit our website, innerworkings.org. See you at the next episode.